Hello, my name is Ryan Matson. I'm an associate professor at West Texas A&M University, and this series of videos will deal with material for the Principles of Macroeconomics Econ 2301 courses. So what I want to start with is a lesson 0, which is an introduction to macroeconomics and what will be guiding us as we go through this material. Now, this is a work in progress, so some things may change and I may have to re-upload a few videos, so I just ask some patience. If you see any mistakes or have any suggestions, please feel free to contact me through my email at rmatson, R-M-A-T-T-S-O-N, at wtamu.edu, and I'll see what I can do. So, all right, the goal of the Econ 2301 really is to understand macroeconomic policy. And I've divided this into what I call 8 easy pieces, with apologies, of course, to Richard Feynman. So what we want to do is we want to learn the basic fluctuations of the business cycle, and then from what we've learned, from what we know of that, translate that into how the Federal Reserve and the federal government will react. So let's begin with some of the foundations. What we'll do in this particular lesson is we want to set up the foundation for the graph you see here, which is the ASAD model that you'll see in any Principles Economics textbook. Now, in many cases, you'll see on an x-axis here a GDP level. What I have, I'll be using an output growth as the horizontal axis, and then you would have, say, a price level, CPI or PCE. What I'll use actually is an inflation gap. So what I'm doing is probably closer to what Cowan and Tabarrok do with Marginal Revolution University, where they place inflation and output growth. I'm taking it one step further and using an output gap and an inflation gap measure to construct my aggregate demand, aggregate supply models. So what we want to do is build up a foundation of this model, because this is what will inform the policy decisions by the federal government and the Federal Reserve during times of financial crises, global pandemics, recessions, etc. So in this particular video, we'll go over some macroeconomic history, and I'll deal with a bit of the graphing and data tools that we will use. So what you'll need to continue on with this series is the Fred add-in for Excel, and of course Excel. And we'll go through why those are important, because in terms of these videos, what we want to do is match up this theory as much as possible to the data that we have. So where does macroeconomics come from? Well, generally we can summarize a lot of the key topics in macroeconomics to a few key thinkers as far back as the 14th century, starting with Ibn Khaldun and his introduction to his works on history, the Muqaddimah. And what he's done is he's noticed a few things about how empires rise and fall that deal with taxation and spending, and what we now know today as fiscal policy. So Khaldun is really one of the first thinkers, at least in terms of the written history that we have, to get this started. And I'm sure I could go back even further, but I like to start around 13th, 14th century with Khaldun. Then we have Smith's great work in 1776, The Wealth of Nations, sort of an inquiry into why certain nations were rich and certain nations were poor, and how economics, how people's choices worked to determine prices and quantities and distributions and things like that. Now, the next great response to that conversation at the macro level would be Karl Marx's 1867 work, Capital. So, of course, we go by that. And then things start to speed up in terms of the written work on what will then be turned into macroeconomics, where we have, of course, John Maynard Keynes's General Theory, published in 1936. Paul Samuelson gives this general theory a mathematical foundation in his Foundations of Economics masterwork. And then Friedman and Schwartz in 1963 publish A Monetary History of the United States, which I think informs most of monetary policy that we see in the United States today. So these are, if you really want to get into the historical context of how these principles textbooks are written, these are the sources of how it came through. Now, of course, there are many people that I've left out here, and feel free to leave any comments about who you think should be added onto this list. If there's anyone that you think that I'm ignoring to my peril, I'd certainly love to see any other works on this as we go along with the video series. Now, in macroeconomics today, the general orthodoxy is usually referred to as what's called a New Keynesian economic perspective. And this has to do with how prices will change slowly. There's a certain rigidity in prices with the macroeconomic fluctuations. And this informs the policy both at the central bank level of the United States, at the Federal Reserve, currently chaired by Jay Powell, and at the fiscal policy level with the current Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, who, by the way, is the former Federal Reserve chairwoman. So these two generally follow that kind of new Keynesian approach and thinking into how these models are set up and how they are put together. Now, there are other perspectives that are valuable and interesting that you can look into. The new classical economists, real business cycle economists, Austrian economists, and one that's gained a bit of popularity and notoriety lately has been the modern monetary theorists. Now, a lot of these use the same kind of assumptions and principles in macroeconomics that we will delve into in this series. So if you're curious about these, again, you can look these things up, or again, leave a comment if you want me to make a video about one in particular, and we can do that. So again, what are we looking forward to in this series, and what can we do? Well, mainly, the other part is, other than the theory and who these people are, is deal with the data of the business cycle. Now, the business cycle is this period of recession and boom. There are those times like the late 90s where, you can find jobs and there are all these kinds of opportunities out there. And then there are those times, say in the Great Recession or the recent global pandemic and novel recession that we're dealing with in 2021, where no matter how good of a worker you are, no matter how entrepreneurial you are, it's hard to find jobs and it's hard for businesses to get off the ground. So this is kind of the tidal waves of the business cycle of creation of firms and jobs and destruction of firms and jobs that happens. And we can see this in two important measures in terms of the output, the production/expenditure of an economy, and the price level or the inflation rate. So a boom, usually in boom times, we'll see kind of higher than trend growth. And I've put an arbitrary little trend of 2% growth here. And we'll get into, when we talk about the output gap, we'll get into a little bit more of a refined version of that. And then we have periods where it's below trend growth. And we kind of see, some of those are bigger than others. But so a recession then is going to be this kind of lower than trend inflation and output growth. But we also have these stagflationary periods where we may have higher inflation and lower output growth. So what we'll focus on are these three distinct types of waves in the macroeconomic fluctuations of the business cycle. And we'll see how they go back to this kind of, how they can be modeled by this ASAD graph, and then we will look at the actual empirical data of how that works. So in order to keep these videos a little short, I'm going to go ahead and cut this part of Lesson 0 short here, and I look forward to working with you all in future videos and emails. Thank you.